Coming up in today's IdeaSpace podcast. Did you feel any pressure at that time, or were you sort of young enough and bold enough to just say, well, we'll figure it out?
Yeah, a mix of stupidity for sure. In the back of my head, I have no idea how to do that. I'll wing it. It'll be fun. You have nothing to lose by trying to do it yourself, because either it works, which is amazing, or it doesn't work. And what you now have on your CV is that you tried and you learned all of these things on the way.
Welcome to the IdeaSpace podcast. I'm Ben Hartley, head of IdeaSpace. IdeaSpace is a community of entrepreneurs, founders and their teams, many of them working alongside each other in one of our 3 offices based in and around Cambridge. Our members share knowledge, experience and expertise to help themselves and others in their high-impact venture creation. In this episode, we're talking with Tristram Norman. Tristram is the co-founder and CTO of Simprints, a non-profit that has created a secure fingerprint identification system for a range of projects in countries around the world. The startup was born out of a Cambridge hackathon and has grown into an organisation working with international NGOs and governments worldwide. Simprints continues to grow, and its technology is helping transform the way the world fights poverty. In this Startup Story episode, we learn about how Simprints was founded by a group of students, how they allocated roles and responsibilities, raised money, developed their own software and hardware, and took their product around the world. It's a fascinating look at one co-founder's journey and a great insight for anyone interested in what it takes to form a high-impact venture. Right. So, Tristram, thank you very much for joining us today for the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Just diving straight on in, I read somewhere that Simprints actually started at a hackathon. Yes. And I guess for those who don't know what that is, it's a social coding event that computer programmers come together and they either invent something new or improve on something else. And can you tell us how all that started?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the really initial idea came from this hackathon, and it was based here in Cambridge, and it was held by another startup with co-founders here in Cambridge called Medic Mobile. I think it was Isaac Coleman specifically who was presenting the idea, the challenge behind the hackathon. And the challenge was a lot of the world's systems are going electronic now. And I'm talking here specifically about data collection, form systems, these types of things. And so there's a lot of aid and healthcare and other services that were paper-based. To give a concrete example, say in many rural areas, healthcare will be delivered directly to the village. So you could have a community health worker or a local doctor or something like that who go to a specific area and they deliver a specific kind of healthcare as an initiative to this area. And so they used to track these programs all paper-based. They would have a big bag full of notepads and pens and forms to collect someone's information. And the challenge here was a lot of this, thanks to Android and other developments, started going electronic-based. So instead of having paper-based forms, you would now have an Android phone. So a community health worker would have an Android device, and they have an app on it, and they'd start collecting data in that device. And this was really great. It was pushing a lot of stuff forward. So a lot of that development was moving forward, but there's one area that, despite all the new technology, wasn't moving forward, and that was identification. So being able to identify the user, the person in front of you, whether you're using a form or whether you're using an app, was still a big challenge. And it's a challenge that we're not aware of here, usually in the UK and the Western world, because when we go to a hospital or something, we have an NHS number, or in the US, you have a social security number, you have a driver's license or your passport. You have valid ways provided by the government to identify you as an individual. This is how you get access to tons of services. And that system, unfortunately, doesn't exist in the entire world. So the World Bank estimates that there's about 1 billion people who don't have what they call formal ID. No way to show up somewhere, get a service and say, I am the person who I'm saying I am. So please give me access to the service. So that was a hackathon challenge, basically, was like, look, we have data collection platforms, we have Android phones and devices, we have these electronic medical record systems now being created. But how do we actually ID people in this system, and how do we link a real human being to this record that's now being created electronically? And that's where the first kind of idea to use biometrics was thrown out there essentially. So Simprints, and it wasn't even called Simprints at the time. I think it was called something else. But it was a group of students who basically said, what if we take biometrics and we link a biometric record to this form and use that as their ID for this form. And we'll do it initially. And it was a very kind of classic startup idea. We'll buy scanners off of Amazon. They're probably $20. We'll write a little bit of software and we'll link it all together and we'll throw it out there and it'll be successful. And that was the first idea. And so that group, I think, won about £1,000 from the hackathon and said, oh, this is so cool. We have this idea now, essentially. And so that was the initial kickoff. And it was shortly after that, with that initial £1,000, where Toby reached out to me, who had very foolishly told him my master's degree was not very challenging and I had tons of free time. I wasn't sure what to do with it. It's a bit of a mistake in hindsight. And he said, oh, well, I have this really cool idea. We just won £1,000 from this hackathon to do this kind of software thing. Would you look into it? I was studying computer science. So they at the time were looking for technical people to flesh it out. And so again, I very foolishly said, yeah, that sounds cool. I'll take a look at it.
And so initially the problem was in the programming, and you obviously have to end up with a device, because I take it that there weren't scanners that were that available or easy to use, or so at what point did it go from, right, well, we're going to develop some software and it's going to be simple to install on some or use some scanner? At what point did you realize, wait a second, we're going to have to probably get involved in the building of the scanner?
A little bit more, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that happens when, I think you look back, that happens very quickly, but at the time it happens surprisingly slowly. Where I think you need, I always tell people, a little jokingly, but a little serious, you need to be pretty naive to start a business, and especially not a not-for-profit business. And so I think we kept that naivety for a while, which kept propelling us to the next step to say, oh, it doesn't exist. We can build it ourselves. It won't be that hard. And it won't need that much money. So the first idea, the very initial idea that came out, and it's actually where the name Simprints came from, was it needs to work on J2ME phones, which we call dumb phones, basically, those old, Nokia bricks and like the small Java applet kind of phones. So what we'll do is we'll create a fingerprint scanner, or we'll buy a fingerprint scanner that takes a fingerprint, sends it via SMS to a service somewhere else, and then texts back a unique code linked to that fingerprint, essentially. And that's the name Simprints, SIM card fingerprints. Was kind of the first name. So the first thing I think we hit in that hurdle is I started doing research on how do you actually do that? How do you make that process work? And it became very apparent this is not going to work on J2ME phones or Java dumb phones. We need to move to smartphones. We need to move to Android specifically. So that was kind of our first thing was, okay, can we find a biometric algorithm that works on Android? And amazingly, the answer to that was no. I dove in thinking this is going to be so simple. Fingerprints have been around for 40 years. And, for 20 years, we've been using systems called AFISs, automatic fingerprint identification systems. Every detective show you've ever seen, they swipe some stuff, they take a photo, and all of a sudden they get the person's identity back. Yeah. Something great. The FBI solved this. They've done it for years ago. And I think the thing at the time is it was all centralized, and none of it was designed for Android. So that was our first challenge was, can we take one of these biometric algorithms? We need an open source one because we want to keep it open source. And can we make it now run on an Android device, right? So this thing that's supposed to run on a server, a rather powerful server, make it run on a device. So we had a resource constraint and we had a money constraint, which is most large biometric companies will sell these they're basically supercomputers to do massive biometric matching. The license starts at about 100,000, and the machines go up to about 2 million. And we're trying to create this thing for small projects where we can give it away for 5,000. And so that was our first challenge, was rewriting that software to work on Android. And the second challenge was, again, the probably even more naive one from our end, where we said, well, we'll buy a fingerprint scanner and we'll use it on Android and we'll do this, only to find out that none of the fingerprint scanners were either rugged enough, worked via Bluetooth, or could communicate with Androids, or just generally have a battery that would last out in the field. didn't exist. The only scanners we could find were the really high-tech, rugged ones that they used at military bases, essentially. And those started at about £2,000, 1,500 to £2,000 per scanner. And we had this dream of trying to get, we still joke about it, the $50 scanner. We didn't get it to $50, but we got it to a couple hundred, I think about 150 to 300, depending on which scanners it was, from that. And so it didn't exist. So we said, well, we'll make one. And not realizing, how much manufacturing and hardware design and electronics and all of that costs. So that was our second challenge. So I think those were our first two really big realizations of this is going to be quite a time-consuming project, is we have to create these two pieces of technology, and we have neither the skill, the cash, or the time to do it, basically.
Right. So it wasn't I was going to say it wasn't the best starting point, but it is, because you knew what you needed to do, which is half the battle, isn't it, really? So how did you allocate roles? Because I guess you were all engaged in a sort of programming sense, in the software element of it, and then you're suddenly realizing that it's going to be there's going to be hardware involved, and also were you able to dish out jobs accordingly? Did someone say, right, I'm going to be doing this, I'm going to be doing that, or was it how structured was that?
So in the early days, it was very unstructured, and it was mostly a student group, and the four co-founders of Simprints were really just the four students who stuck with it, the four of us who stayed with it. But we had tons of people in the early days coming in and out. And so our initial plan here was, okay, we have £1,000. That's enough to buy pizza. So every Sunday at a certain time, we are going to meet, we're going to buy pizza, and we're going to capture this area of the student union building, and we're going to talk about the idea and what we can do and how people can help and what we'll build. And we're going to bribe people with this food to pull them in. So we had tons of people who came through and helped at different stages. And I think that's it's always the first lesson I share with people when talking about startups is you need to get very comfortable and practiced at, and a little bit shameless at, asking for help. You just ask everyone for help. Be completely shameless at asking for help. And so we tried to recruit as many people as we could, essentially. As it became more full-time, and it moved from just brainstorming ideas and talking about what we could do, and we started to get a little bit closer to role definitions, that didn't even happen then for a little bit ways down the track. It was quite organic. Of the four co-founders, we each kind of were brought in because we had a specific niche that we were in. So me specifically software. Alexandra, she didn't have any hardware experience, but we somehow roped her into coming over from what she was doing to do some hardware. And Toby was always kind of the idea person, and the great public speaker. So he was kind of drumming up support, finding and raising money, these types of things. And Dan was a researcher, great researcher, and you need to do quite a lot of research when it comes to biometrics to prove its accuracy and to prove your impact and those types of things. So we fell into those specific roles quite easily. That evolves hugely over time. I mean, they're very different now, 6 years down the road, than it was in the beginning. But the initial kickoff was, we left it very undefined, which I think helped us. And everyone just focused on what they were good at and what they were interested in. But there's a point later on, probably a year in, where that had to get more structured, where the titles appeared, where hiring happened. And that was really when we realized that it would be a company and not just kind of a student idea.
Right.
So we applied for this grant called Saving Lives at Birth, and we applied for a range of small grants from the UK government, from DFID, Innovate UK, and for different sums of money, and we just kept incrementally taking those steps up. So the first one was a grant. I think we got £5,000 to get enough space to buy us some space at Makespace in Cambridge, which is one of the great things about being in Cambridge, to buy us more pizza, to keep people fed, buy some coffees for externals when we would go and bug people at ARM and all the other companies around Cambridge. And it's kind of a market proof to just do some research. The next one then we won was around £12,000, kind of a proof of concept, another market proof of could you actually sell this thing? And it is one of the great things about Innovate UK. They will give you incremental grants and specific things. There's a lot out there if you put in the time and effort. And then we got a Saving Lives at Birth award, which is a whole mix of Bill and Melinda Gates, UK Aid, Canada Aid, US Aid, where they pool money together and they put them out. And I think they gave us about $150,000, which for us was that flipping point where we were still all students. We were all kind of semi doing something else. And we said, oh my God, again, very naively, we have $150,000. We'll never be able to spend this much money. We're going to be able to start a company. I always joke now, I think Simprints just overheads is about 250,000 pounds a month. And so with our initial windfall of cash, we're like, oh, wow, what are we going to do? Let's start a company. We'll turn it into a real business. Assuming that would be very easy. And that's when that structure started to appear. But there was a good year of early days where we didn't really have any of that.
Yeah. I'm just interested, at that point, did you actually have a business plan? When you've decided, look, I think we've got a company here, did you then sit down and say, right, we need an actual business plan to work off? Or did it remain off plan for a bit longer?
I think one of the early things that we got right was putting together a business plan. And I think calling a business plan in the traditional sense is probably a little generous, to be honest. But I think what we really focused on and what we spent all of our initial money on was talking to clients and talking to consumers and talking to the people who would need to use something like this. So the first £5,000 that we scraped together is from a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo campaign or something like that. We spent the entire thing to fly ourselves out to Bangladesh and go talk to BRAC, which is the world's largest NGO, and say, hey, we have this idea. Is this a pain point for you? And it was one of the things that kept us going initially is everyone just kept saying, yeah, we need this. Why doesn't this not exist now? Give this to us. And we kept saying, well, we don't have it yet. It doesn't work. But this is... But
at least you know at that point that someone wants it, because the great idea that there might be reasons why there's not that product out there. There might be specific reasons in the field why it doesn't work, and at that point, I guess you don't know until you start asking those questions. So did you actually know? I was going to say who the customer was. I mean, you realised that it needs to be out there in the field, but who did you know who would buy it? If you know what I mean at that point.
Yeah, and I think that we didn't know specifically who was the customer in the sense of who exactly would we be selling to versus who was going to be using it.
Yeah, the consumer, but not necessarily the customer in a way.
Exactly. And in a kind of funny thing, even today in Simprints, that's a bit of a challenge. I think for most businesses, it's the kind of always evolving customer base. The one that we didn't know that we do know now is in international development, who gives you the money and who uses your product is not the same. And it's actually a huge pain point of this space, which is money comes from foundations and funders and grants and these types of things. But the users are the people in the field and the people who are actually bringing this tablet out, or the patient or the receiver who's being visited is receiving essentially the care or the service. And it's a very difficult thing to do that we initially didn't understand and then had to put quite a lot of time and energy into figuring out how to balance, which is we are going to sell to this one group over here because they have the money that is going into international development. But we need to design and build for this group over here who are actually going to be using the product and have actually very different needs than what your initial customer wants to see at the user at it. And it's one of the unfortunate reasons that so many product-based companies die off in this space is they can't resolve what the realities of what actually needs to happen in the field with what's being funded, because it's not your classic B2C use case. We always joke that those like Apple have it so easy. If the person buying the phone doesn't like something, they tell Apple and Apple needs to fix it. And if they don't, less people will buy phones. And so that's a very direct relationship. Whereas for us, we are going to get large funding opportunities from the likes of US Aid, UK Aid, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, But our users are the community health workers, the regional managers, the district managers who actually work then for the NGOs or INGOs who are directly there applying that service. And figuring out how to link your product between those two needs is something very important that you have to get right in the early days, to be able to say, look, this is going to fit both of your needs, and we're going to figure out how to kind of balance that. That took quite a long time to get used to, but it's also something that we focused on really, really heavily. As the technical person, I say way too heavily, because then by the time that we sold our first range of projects, we had no product. And so, we were making promises of what we were going to do long before we were ready to deliver on those. But the upside of that was we were getting a much clearer image of both the need, but also the realities of what we would have to build and deliver. But on a product company, that's a never-ending journey. We're still building features now that we wish we had in the initial days, and we've gotten rid of a whole range of features and products that we built in the early days, assuming is what they would need at scale, and just wasn't needed.
And did you personally feel any pressure, obviously, because there's a lot of saying, well, this is what we will do and what we will have, and knowing that at some point you will actually have to make that happen. Did you feel any pressure at that time, or were you sort of young enough and bold enough to just say, well, we'll figure it out?
Yeah, a mix of stupidity for sure. Percent, yeah, I can do that. It's not a problem. In the back of my head going, I have no idea how to do that. I'll wing it. It'll be fine. This 100,000 person NGO will never notice that this guy over here is just winging this software stack. So yeah, you need a mix of boldness / stupidity. And it's definitely one of the biggest tension points of an initial funding team. If you're going to start an idea that is technical in nature, but you also have to sell it, that is your most painful area, is the promises that you need to make on one side, and then the realities of delivering those on the other side, is where so much of our time and energy went into. I think one of the things that we focused quite a lot on as the founding team was, well, I think there's two main areas as a founding team that we really focused quite heavily on. One was just keep everything very flat. Don't get politics involved. When it became a company, it was just split everything evenly. Don't argue about who's been here longer, who does what, the importance of the different roles, et cetera, et cetera. And you can never do that perfectly. There's always tension there, of course. But it was always one of our things was just don't focus so much on the small stuff, right? None of this matters. No shares or ownership or titles matter if this thing is not working or around in a couple of years. So don't get caught up in that. And I think another one was always just really working on team dynamics. And so one of the areas I have to give Toby a lot of credit for was he always, while he would drive me insane because he's making lots of promises on my behalf for technical things to be delivered, he was very passionate about strong teams and team dynamics. So we, as the co-founders and the early team, had to read the book 5 Dysfunctions of a Team so many times. I think I have that book memorized at that point. We would have frequent offsites where we would go away for a couple of days or a week as a team and discuss the dynamics, discuss the pain points and the frustration points, try and keep it very open, try and keep politics out of it. And he was constantly drilling in that area of, we need to get these things right. We need to do that. Which is why I suspect we've lasted quite a long time despite all the early promises and failed projects and those types of things. So,
Interesting. And so you've flown out to Bangladesh. I know we're sort of jumping back a bit. I mean, that must have been a really exciting trip because that's your first kind of view into where this is going to end up. You're actually seeing firsthand. Was that a real inspiration to kind of keep going?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the big inspirations in this space and one of the reasons people are stuck with it is, we care about the cause behind it, right? And so you need to balance all the different team passions, but some of us are more passionate about the technology itself. Some are more passionate about the NGO specifically or the research, but getting to actually go out in the field and see the users, the use cases and the scenarios is hugely rewarding. It's really, really great. It's one of the things, one of the more, ironically, one of the more frustrating times in Simprints for me personally was the time when I want to get to the field. A lot of people want me to get to the field, but there's so much technical stuff that needs to be done that I can't. And I'm looking back at the early days where, we had nothing to do because we were students. So we hopped on a plane and went out there, and we could spend weeks doing that, and not be able to kind of do that anymore. But it was a big one. And we actually started with one of the things that we put money into initially when we started recruiting people and hiring people. We knew we could never compete with salary, especially for engineers, in hiring people. So one of the big things that we focused on was actually then just field opportunities, which was, look, come and be an engineer at Simprints or work at Simprints, and do any of these other roles. But we will put it costs thousands of pounds per person. It's not as simple as, buy a ticket. There's tons of work that goes into it to make it impactful. I think there's a lot of voluntourism, but there's not a lot of kind of impactful visiting of these sites. So it takes a lot to go into that. But we specifically would put money into that as a company. We would say every person will allocate several £1,000s per person to make sure that we can get them out there and keep improving the product, see the real use cases, see what it's for. And so in Bangladesh, that was great. I mean, Toby has worked with Brack before, which is how we had that relationship. But for me, and I think a lot of the other people who we're working with, that was the first time in Bangladesh. And so it was a really amazing experience to just see, just how amazing some of these organizations are, and the work that they do. And then the other is just the reality of how this thing needs to work. It seems weird. We think, it has to work offline, but sure, how long, a day or two, to then go out there and realize, no, there's no cell phone service. There is no access to charging or anything like this. We really need to get these key things right if it's going to survive. I think it's just a very eye-opening experience.
Mm. And when was the first project where the device, or everything in the chain works end to end? When was the first project that you saw that happen? And talk about that if you can.
So our first, we had a couple projects, and we had kind of two projects starting off at roughly the same time. One in Nepal, one in a very rural area in western Nepal. And one in Bangladesh. It was in an urban slum. So closer to Dhaka, very central actually in Dhaka, much more urban. And we had those two use cases at the same time. And one of those projects did not go well. And so the technology was not ready. There was some use cases that we just hadn't thought about. And it's the most simple stuff. We had spent a year or more getting the design and the feel of the scanner right, and the usability of the scanner right. And we'd reached out to all these firms who helped us design how the PCB would work and the different components. And we put it through environmental testing to make sure that as an electronic component, it could survive. And we got it out into the field in Western Nepal. And I had my firmware engineer at the time. He wakes up, it's his birthday. He wakes up at 2 a.m. And every single scanner, he had laid out 40 scanners all to charge overnight for the first kickoff day. And every single scanner had turned itself on. They were all sitting there flashing. And he thought, that's really weird. I don't know why that happened. So he went and he turned them off. And as he was turning them off, he reached the end of the line, and the ones at the beginning of the line started turning themselves back on again. And he's going, what?
Oh, no.
And he's at this point, he's going, what is happening? And he turns them off, and they won't shut off, basically. And the problem here means that their batteries will be flat by the time that we've done the training and get these things out into the field, because their battery life is several hours, but they have to be turned off between all the visits, basically, because they have, fairly chunky components in there that do use quite a lot of juice. And so I get this great frantic phone call on a Saturday, very early in the morning, saying, the scanners are turning on, they won't shut off, we can't charge them, they keep coming back to life. I called up one of my other engineers at the time, so we head into the office, Saturday morning, 8 a.m. We called it the zombie issue because scanners kept coming back to life, and we had no idea why. And what it turned out to be basically was there's a capacitor in there that holds a certain amount of charge, and so to turn on the power circuit, you would basically overflow this. So you'd hold down the button, and it would send electricity now to the area that needs to be shut up to turn on. And when that reached a certain heat, it would overflow and it would trigger the power cycle. In short, it would turn on the unit. And we just, in the environmental testing here in the UK, hadn't covered the use case of the heat that you would reach in Western Nepal, and the humidity, the high level of humidity. So we basically had these scanners that couldn't shut off because this capacitor would keep overflowing and telling them to turn themselves on. So we sat there with pieces of paper on the floor, looking at the firmware, trying to figure out how do we shut these things off, because we can't fix the hardware at this point. Shipping them to to Nepal took 3 months. 1 month to ship them, 2 months to clear customs and all of the other logistics there. And we won't be able to fix them out there in the field. I mean, we've done crazy stuff at this point. I remember one time Alexandra had the PCB out of a bunch of the scanners, and she turned the oven on, and she was putting the PCB of the scanners in an oven in this Airbnb that we had, to try and resolder components to the PCB. And so we basically had to figure out a firmware fix for this. So we created a sliding window where, if the power button had to be held down for a certain period of time before the unit would power on. And if the unit got turned on, but it didn't sense then the sliding window of holding down the power button continued, it would shut itself off. Not a perfect fix. You still lose power in the whole turn on, turn off.
Yeah.
But, a good enough fix to keep the project going. And anyway, we hit so many issues like that. 2 months later, we have no data on how the project's doing because none of the syncing architecture infrastructure is working on Androids. We're losing patients because just the communications between the data collection platform apps and the biometrics isn't working. And so we had many of those. I think the first time, though, it all was working end to end was probably the Bangladesh project, where we started, I think, when the flow of feedback changed directions from our partners saying, you need to fix all these issues, stuff is broken, it's not working, I have all these frustrations. When the flow of feedback finally started going the other direction, where we're able to say, hey, we see this data, these users have low accuracies, we're starting to spot discrepancies in the project here, we think you guys might be losing forms or client or people here in your project, was, I think, the first real moment of okay, the system works.
Yeah.
Still a lot to fix.
No, I'm sure.
Yeah, but.
And so, how long? What's the timescale then from your hackathon to that point?
I think that was probably about somewhere between 2 and 3 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess you got to ask also. Were you able to be paying yourself at this point? Because I guess early on, for the point where it's a student project and it's forming a company, yes, because we have to form a company, but we don't quite have the money yet. But you're able to sustain yourselves and know that this is something that you can continue working on.
Yeah, and so I think we survived the first year solely off of my other 3 co-founders were still PhD students at the time. So they were living off their PhD stipends and working on their PhDs. And I moved into my parents' basement, who lived in Cambridge, and basically lived in the basement for about 6 months with no salary, and no idea what to do. And so that was, I think, the first initial bit. And then when we got the first grant from Saving Lives at Birth is when we gave ourselves salaries. We say salaries, I mean, we paid ourselves $18K a year. And which was basically the PhD stipend amount,
yeah.
that we could survive off of. But it also allowed us to hire the first couple of people that we hired, which was, called a proper, founding of Simprints, if you will, when we incorporated, which was in 2015.
Okay.
And so I would say there's basically the year before where the hackathon happened, and I lived in the basement, and everyone else was still doing their PhDs. And then after that, we got an office, which was Idea Space. And so, that was our first official office, and we gave ourselves salaries, and, we worked full time on it. Even then, some people had to wrap up their PhDs, and other things. I think a lot of that probably was slightly motivated by as an engineer, people were prodding me to, come work for us. We'll give you real money. And me living in the basement and saying, no, I think this idea is really cool. It will work. We can do something with this. And we finally said, okay, we're all this is no longer a weekend project or a student hobby project. We're probably putting hours into this. So that was the beginning. Yeah.
And your time at IdeaSpace, how did that obviously sort of worked out for you? Did it help you connect with other organizations around Cambridge?
Yeah, I mean, we loved IdeaSpace. And so it was great to, just have like an official working space and meet other companies and get to meet people. It was such a nice ecosystem because you have IdeaSpace, you have MakeSpace, and they're all in there, and there's all these events happening. It's one of the really great things of just Cambridge as a whole, is the fact that we have access to these types of things. And I think having IdeaSpace was just, we couldn't afford an office. We couldn't afford anything like that. And so just being able to have a place to work and a place to meet other like-minded entrepreneurs was great. And so, central and access to, people in the university. And it's still that same lesson I give to people, which is, get shameless for asking for stuff. We knocked on every door.
Yeah.
We went to every, meetup that we could find. We annoyed everyone at IdeaSpace. I jokingly say that by the time Simprints left IdeaSpace, everyone there was just so sick of us.
But it's great. It's great advice because some entrepreneurs, there's a stereotype of them maybe being quite outgoing, or some founders, charismatic founders can just go out and do things and ask for things and be bold in that regard. But many, especially within tech circles, seem to be very orientated in their specialist field. They're not necessarily outgoing, or they're not, they don't think about selling themselves and asking for things. But it's interesting you say how important that was for you, and it's something I'm sure that a lot of people could learn from. At the time, did you have any mentors, either personally or for the organization? And also, did you have a board or some kind of advisory board that you put together to help you at a higher level?
Yeah. I mean, it was one of our really early things that we put quite a lot of effort into, was finding mentors and then finding an advisory board. And so I think the really big things there are, the first really key thing to being a good entrepreneur, at least just from my individual point of view, is you have to be very comfortable admitting that you know nothing, right? You have an idea and you have something that you want to do, but you don't know how to do it, and you don't know all the complexities and the components to it. And one of the really amazing things is people love helping. If people will say no, of course, but that's also what I always say. That's the worst case, scenario. Ask them for help, and they might say no. So what? Ask, and then keep going, find the next group to ask you for help. But so many people in Cambridge said yes, and so we very quickly put together a board of advisors. So we had Dominic Virgin from ARM, who would come in and talk about, how basically corporate social responsibility and those types of things worked. And he was very supportive in linking us to other entrepreneurial and not-for-profit groups here in Cambridge. We had Darren Disley, who started many businesses here in Cambridge. So Horizon and all of them. Has been a huge supporter of us over the years. And I know him and Toby still frequently meet to just discuss how to run the business and what are the things that you have to watch out for, and what are the key things when putting together a team, and when to push and when to back off. And so, I mean, we've all had huge mentor groups. One of the ones I also really enjoyed was we reached out to GLG. So GLG is kind of a consulting group, but what they do is they link industry experts to each other. And so you go to GLG and you say, hey, I'm doing a project in this specialist area. Can you find me experts out there who would be willing to talk to me about X, Y, and Z? They put together a social impact fund, essentially, where they said, look, what we'll do is we'll use this group, but if you're a social entrepreneur, you can use it for free. And so you can ask us to find you experts, and we'll pay for it, instead of you guys paying for it. And that was huge because we put together a mentorship program. So I worked with Matthew Davey from Kiva. Kiva is a nonprofit. They do microtransaction platforms, really great group in the US. And he's been working in this field for a huge amount of time. And then the other ones is we just reach out shamelessly to everyone we knew. John Jackson from Damagi. Comcare so Damagi builds Comcare, and it's the world's largest data collection platform. And definitely in this space, it's used all over the place. And he now sits on our board. And so again, it's just the shameless annoying and begging for support. But it's really important. So we had an advisory group at some points that's been 20 or 30 people. And we now run a proper full-time board of about, I believe that there's about 8 of us on the board at the moment, but it's mostly then people who've been and done this before. Don't recreate the wheel, basically.
And I guess for you, as Simprints grew into what it is now, from being very technical, were you then stepping back into more of a leadership role or managing a team rather than doing the tech yourself?
Yeah, I think I went through a very classic CTO startup life cycle, is what I call it, which is you get called the CTO because you're the first and only engineer on the team. And then so you build the initial technology, which as a student really means you learn how to build it, and then you rebuild it properly the second time around. And so I went from doing kind of all the initial software development, and I was still working a lot on bringing people in. We would hold hackathons with Redgate and with ARM, and we'd spend a week saying, please give me engineers for a week, and I need to get these things done. So there's some leadership there, and there's a lot of I jokingly call it cheerleading, but it's a very important ability to say, this is really cool, come help us. And then kind of realizing that we have so much, now we have real projects to deliver. We can't do as much of this outreach. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy. You have to be very specific about what you want to get done. We really need to be hiring, focusing more internally on getting all these key systems right. So going from then being, the only engineer to an engineer who had 3 other engineers and figuring out how to be a senior engineer, how to answer their questions. But we hired engineers who are way more experienced than I am. So a little bit of that, difficult leadership learning curve of, how do I now manage people and their expectations and their performance, but they know so much more than I do in this space. To then one day realizing, oh my God, I'm managing 11 engineers. I'm not an engineer anymore. I'm a full-time manager, but there's so many other technical priorities that I need to be doing that are falling behind our technical strategy, our big picture where we're trying to go. And actually saying, now I need to bring in people who are going to help me manage and lead and do the range of leading them, but also getting closer to the technology again to create at least some kind of strategy and some kind of pathway that we can follow. And so, and then all the way back to now that leadership structure working very well to actually saying, oh, wow, I'm actually very technical again. I do a small amount of leadership and guidance of this is how the team should run and this is where we want to be going. But I have actual genuine CTO time of I can crack stuff open, I can look at the next thing, and then I can bring that stuff back to the team. But I've done that full loop all the way around to this point, and so
I've read about about the flexible working routines with staff at Simprints, unlimited paid time off and completely flexible working hours. Is that something that was instigated early on, or did it just evolve that way because that's the way it worked best?
Yeah, it's something we instigated very early on. And so when we started hiring, we quickly realized that not a lot of people would go for $18K a year. And so we managed to sucker in some co-students with us and say, come join us, $18K a year, it's great. It's a lot of money, but entering the market was like, okay, wow, we have no way to compete, and especially at the time, all of the salaries for engineers are just skyrocketing because of Google and Apple and Microsoft and the likes. And so we said, well, look, we're well aware we can't compete in salary. So what are the things that we can compete in? And we really honed in on a couple areas, which was, meaning in work, flexibility and time, and responsibility and accountability, right? And really autonomy, right? And so sorry, a fourth one, and a very important fourth one in there, which is, learning and opportunities. And so we really honed in on those and made it very clear that, look, we can't pay you what other companies are going to pay you, but the things that you get in return for that are just great opportunities to go to the field, to work for a great cause. And we would specifically say, we called it EduPrints, which was, we would put, a couple £1,000 every year for you to use specifically on learning, do courses, go to conferences, spend time to go and have a hackathon or have these ideas together, and really focus on people having dedicated time to do that. And then the other one was flexibility. And with that, we just said, look, unlimited paid time off. Our goal is to make sure that your work is very clear. And so, how much time you need to get that done, but then how you do that and the time that you do that is completely up to you. It's not a perfect system. It's gone through so many fluctuations and changes through the last 6 years. From when we really started, there's a very genuine do whatever you want, which really then ended up being, you don't take any time off, and it doesn't matter when you work because it's still, 80 or 90 hours a week. So we're still going to see you in the office anyway, which you do need a bit of, just to be candid, when you do a startup, unless you have kind of VC funding. You do have to have that, to then realizing, look, this is not sustainable, and so, yeah, you have unlimited paid time off, but you have to take at least first the legal minimum, right? So, you have to take at least that, and we have to track employee, overall health closer, and those types of things. And then timing wise, we work remotely mostly now, and so we have all the different time zones, but how to shift that from an organizational level to a team level was very important. A lot of people joined and they said, I want to work with everyone. This is fantastic. I want to do it. A lot of teams came back and said, this is super annoying. Whenever I need this person, they're not here. So we don't like, the fact that people can work whenever they want. We want 9 to 5. We want everyone to be here. And so we definitely went through some cultural, not battles. It was never that bad to that point, but we've gone through cultural changes where at different points in time we've adjusted. And I think ultimately we've come out to, look, we have organizational guidelines, and things that we just have to adhere to. But then internally it comes down to the team. So you guys design how you want to do this, and what's kind of important for your teams. And we, from an organizational level, just want to track, health and happiness of those teams.
And did you manage yourself? Obviously, as lots of founders of startups will know, it can take a little bit of a heavy toll on your personal life. Were you able to manage that through that whole period?
Yeah, my hair is a lot grayer than it used to be. It was hard. It was really hard. I think this is where just finding as much support as you can is really important to help you through those conversations. I still remember the first person I had to let go. They were significantly more experienced and older than I was, but it just wasn't working out. But I made all the classic startup mistakes. I waited way too long, way too many opportunities, way too much, flex and slack, when I really should have, and everyone tells you that, they say the worst thing you can do is hire a bad person, and the worst thing you can do is keep them for a long period of time. And to be clear, not a bad person because they are a bad person, but it's not working because they're just not fitting with the company and the culture. And so I did all the classics, we'll adjust, we can change it, they'll come around, to then the tough conversations, to then realizing, no, this doesn't work. And so now I almost feel mean in some occasions, but I'm just much more lethal. And because I used to in the day say, these people are so harsh, everyone can do whatever they want. So now thinking, no, you just have to at some points, pull that trigger. It's hard. It's really hard. I don't know if I would have been able to do it if I wasn't in Cambridge, and the founding team wasn't a close group of friends, and a lot of the people were people that I know, and all those types of things. I think if I'd set out to do that on my own, I probably would have, after several months, said, "This is just not worth it." And so, maybe not fair, but it's very difficult. It's one of the early skills you get is stress management, for sure.
Yeah, I bet. Well, yeah, you must be very proud of yourself for having stuck through, because it's an incredible organization. I didn't necessarily want to sort of touch on COVID because we've all heard enough of it, but when you've got a company like yours and a global pandemic, how has that affected you, or the way that you work, or does it change how you look at the future of things because of we may be getting more of this, and tracking vaccinations, etc. Things like that are going to be very important, as they have been. But how did it affect you at Simprints?
So COVID was very hard, and so on us. And I think the first one there is not just on us, but on our space. And so I wouldn't quote me directly on this percentage because I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but basically somewhere between 70 and 80% of the organizations in this space ran out of money in the last 2 years because every project stopped. And so all of our projects stopped. Everything went on to hold. All of the funding stopped. And we were very fortunate because we keep very close eyes on and keep quite tight purse strings. And so we were able to plan out and forecast well ahead and kind of push stuff quite a bit to actually, we didn't have to lay anyone off or shrink or even, let people go off full time on furlough and stuff. We didn't have to put them on the 80% salary. We were able to keep it together and running throughout that period of time. But while that's happening, it was really difficult because we have all these huge internal issues start arising because you don't see people anymore. Everything's gone virtual. All these stresses come piling in. Everything's changing. And so you go through a huge company level of frustration. People are frustrated, and you've probably been reading about it. And I know it's been more in the news recently, but in the early days, we were really seeing this. They call it the Great Resignation. And so a huge percentage of people, especially mid-career people, have quit their jobs. And so we saw that early in Simprints. So about 20% of the staff just said, I'm leaving. I want to go do something else. Frequently, it was about stability, especially when it came to engineers. They said, look, I love this, but these other companies are offering me more money, less work, longer runways. They're not worried about those companies going out of business. And a lot of people, especially with families, found it very, very difficult. That then I think hit a lot of our other companies in this area. They all started messaging to us the same thing. So many people are leaving. The market's flipping upside down, which is also great. Now there's really great people in the market to go and snatch up if you can. And then I think it hit the commercial space, a couple months after that. So now what they call the Great Resignation. So we went through that. So kind of trying to figure out how to balance that, how to balance a large amount of resignations, a completely new working style, trying to get teams coordinated and aligned was very difficult. And so I think all you can really do at that point as a leader is really lean into reiterating to people that, look, personal health is our utmost priority. So you guys need to take the time that you need. We're going to make sure that the salaries keep coming through. And then ultimately when people say they're leaving, you just have to wish them luck and say, look, I understand it's not ideal for Simprints, but everyone's in the same boat in this pandemic, and we wish you the best. And you just do that for 2 years.
Yeah. Well, it's
tricky. Yeah.
Anyone who has managed to pull themselves through and come out the other side has done incredibly well. So, yeah. So what's the next event, or I was going to say, what's the next 5 years look like, but it's impossible to predict, isn't it?
Hard to say. I think, so for the last 6 months, we've just really been focusing on adjusting and rebuilding the team. And so, which for us then has been hugely rewarding. And so it's actually really exciting now to see the new team starting to kind of get their hands on the projects, and a lot of the stuff that we built survived throughout the pandemic and kept working. So it's great to see we have this strong foundation. So we have now looking at just how do we keep our strategy clear? How do we keep everyone rowing in the same direction? And for that now, there's bigger and larger projects coming up for us to tackle. So we're getting more government level projects. They're coming with their own complications, but we have about 1.7 million people enrolled. And a lot of that has come in quite recently in the last year, from the last 6 years. And so there's quite a lot of growth happening in that. And for us, as you mentioned earlier, vaccination tracking, there's a lot of exciting things happening in that space. Unfortunately, programs like COVAX and that, they didn't work out very well, but it is really showing people the importance of getting good identification systems. And for us, that's the role of what role does biometrics play in these identification systems? We're starting to see a lot of exciting projects in that space. So I think the next couple of years for us look like, we've regrown to a similar size as pre-pandemic, but we have a great velocity and a really excited team. And so it's just going to be, well, me specifically and my team is just getting the projects done, right? If we have partnerships in them, they're looking way further out what comes next. And we're looking at how do we actually get these things done in the next year. But we're exploring a couple of interesting avenues. So there's a lot more contactless biometrics is very important in this space. So we're looking at different types of modalities, face recognition, palm recognition, this type of thing. We're looking more now at open sourcing is one of the interesting areas that we're looking at. We've always been very open, but some of the core stuff in our technical stack, we haven't been able to open source for just privacy and security and ethical concerns that we have. And even not just concerns from us, but our funders saying, whoa, wait a minute, you can't open source something like that. What if, people use it for things that aren't good? And so we're working through those and focusing quite heavily on making sure that we have strong privacy and security and standards at Simprints. And I think following that train for the next couple of years is going to be the next one. One thing I'd say we're being a lot more cautious. When we had our first big couple projects, we went through nothing crazy. You're not talking hypergrowth like PayPal, where they're like, we need to hire 20,000 people. But for us, it was saying, oh, we need to go from 10 to 50, and we need to do it pretty quickly. And that was fast and painful because there's a lot of reorganizing, and you take the human equivalent of technical debt when you do that. You say, we're going to hire a lot of people and we're going to figure out these systems later. There's a lot of pain that you have to pay back when you figure out those systems. We're now being much more cautious, but we're still aiming for that same level of growth that we've had as a company, but by growing on the people side in a much steadier, more maintainable rate, focusing on the systems first and getting those right, and then moving up to that next level. And so I think that's quite important. So yeah, I would leave it at that. A mix of R&D, growing as a company, great projects coming up. I think there's a couple in there. Yeah.
Yeah, exciting. Well, it's as I said before, it's an incredible organization, and the end product is really helping the world's poorest people and people who are struggling in the world, and you're helping to make that a better place. So
trying to, at least.
Yeah,
never
absolutely.
Perfect. It doesn't always work, but
no, but it's all heading in the right direction. What might be one thing that you could summarize and pass to any entrepreneurs and potential future founders? What lesson might you give? You've given loads anyway. What would you summarize for them?
I think I'd summarize with I always find it kind of cheesy, and I hate when people say it, but then I end up saying it a lot myself, which is, find something that you are really passionate about and to strive towards, because every job is work. You are going to be working, but if what you do is what you love, then it's going to just be that much better, right? And as an entrepreneur, you're going to have to put in a lot of hours. So make sure that the thing you're putting your hours into is something that you're very passionate about. And so, follow your passion, but then follow up that immediately saying, do it, take that leap. If you're sitting there on the brink thinking, what do I do? Should I do it? it's always worth doing. There's no downsides to it. I think one of the great pieces of advice that I got early on was I was in later round interviews at this point with Facebook, and they were saying, come join us, and you'll get great salary and join big tech. And 6 years ago, when Facebook was less hated and much more exciting, that was really kind of looking great. And then Simprints, one of the great pieces of advice I got was, well, look, you have nothing to lose by trying to do it yourself, because either it works, which is amazing, or it doesn't work. And what you now have on your CV is that you tried and you learned all of these things on the way. And any recruiter or someone building a team worth their salt is going to look at that and say, that's great experience. It doesn't matter that it failed. What you learned is huge. So do it, take that leap. And then the third one there, I'll just end with, it was the same one I've kind of been harping on for a while now, is be shameless in asking for support and help. And so to run an organization, you need to learn a lot. You need to constantly be learning. You need to constantly, move. And there's so many people out there who will help you do that. So just start knocking on their doors and asking them for help. And there's tons of great people out there, and especially in places like Cambridge, where you have these amazing ecosystems, they will help you. And so, be shameless.
Great. Fantastic advice. Tristram, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And there's so much to take away from the last hour. So it's going to be incredibly useful for lots of people listening. So thank you from all of us.
Great. Thank you for having me, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. For more information or any inquiries about joining Ideaspace, please contact us via ideaspace.cam.ac.uk or via any of our social media channels.